Nous formons la prochaine génération pour relever les défis stratégiques de demain. Nous sommes dédiés à comprendre pour mieux agir.
Alors, nous sommes de retour. C'est tout un honneur pour moi d'accueillir la professeure Marina Henke au colloque annuel du réseau d'analyse stratégique. Elle est professeure de relations internationales à la Hertie School à Berlin et directrice du Hertie Center for International Security. C'est une experte de pointe sur les alliances, les interventions militaires et les politiques de défense européennes. Dr. Marina Henke's bio is in the program, but maybe I will just add that before joining the Hertie School, she was an assistant professor at Northwestern University, and that you can read her work in the journals International Security, Security Studies, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Strategic Studies, among many others. I'll also mention her 2019 book, Constructing Allied Cooperation, Diplomacy, Payments, and Power in Multilateral Military Coalitions, published with Cornell University Press. Marina, we would really have liked to welcome you to Canada for this colloquium. While it's very convenient for all of us to gather in this way, we'll have to wait a little bit longer before we can all meet again in person. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for closing off the colloquium. I'll stay on to moderate the Q&A, but for now, the floor is entirely yours.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie. C'est un très grand plaisir d'être parmi vous cet après-midi. Comme vous voyez, je parle français. Je fais toutes mes études en France. Néanmoins, aujourd'hui, je fais la plupart de mes recherches en anglais, donc je ferai mon discours aujourd'hui en anglais. Mais si vous avez des questions à la suite en français, posez-le en français, s'il vous plaît. I know this colloquium focuses on the challenges Canada faces in a structured international order. I also know that there are a lot of Canada experts in the audience. I'm not one of them, and that's why I will refrain from analyzing Canadian policy and talk about what I know best, and this is the transatlantic relationship. And to do so, I will share my screen. Because, so what Stephanie didn't mention was that I actually still have a double appointment. So I'm at the Hertie School in Berlin, but I'm still as well at Northwestern University in Chicago. And, you know, prior to COVID, I was shuttling back and forth the Atlantic quite a bit. Now it's, of course, much harder. But of course, it helps to gain an understanding on what's going on both sides of these Atlantics. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about the social, political, and economic forces that are shaping attitudes towards NATO in those two critical NATO states, the United States and Germany, and then predict from these social, political, and economic forces what the future holds for NATO. And I'm sure Canada, as a proud NATO country, needs to know what happens in those states and, you know, what the consequences are for Canadian foreign policy, of course. So let's get started. Let's start with the United States. As many of you know, their grand strategic postures or grand strategy that have been dominating American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. The most predominant one is still liberal internationalism. Some would call it as well deep engagement or Wilsonianism. Then for a while, especially during the George W. Bush administration, we had neoconservative ideas being very present. Sometimes they're called as well ideas of primacy, of US primacy. And then more recently, we have seen a renaissance. Others would say it's a completely new concept called restraint, retrenchment, or some would call it as well offshore balancing. So I would argue that neoconservatism and primacy is kind of on its way out. Probably John Bolton, who was the national security advisor in the Trump administration, was the last neocon in a very powerful position in the United States. But what we do see play out is a battle between liberal internationalism and restraint. So I'd like to dive into those two grand strategies a little bit further. So what's liberal internationalism? Well, it's basically the idea that the United States should promote democracy, free trade, and international institutions. That's the liberal world order, as many of you have heard, I'm sure, in the past. So it's a US responsibility. It requires US leadership. And if these three pillars are stable, the idea goes, then we have peace and to a certain degree as well, prosperity in the world. So Restraint sees that very differently. So here the notion is that actually the United States is inherently a very secure country. So there is no actual need to preserve US peace, meaning peace for the American homeland. The United States has two militarily weak neighbors. That's, of course, Canada and Mexico. And then it's protected by two massive oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. So, from this viewpoint, then, it's not an American responsibility to uphold this liberal world order. And what is more, the United States can actually not afford it because it's incredibly expensive. And it's not just expensive, but it's actually counterproductive if you listen to these restraint advocates, because the promotion of these values, such as democracy and human rights, inspires crusades. And here, most famously, they would point to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, that then generate resentment in the local populations, and even balancing against the United States. So restraint advocates would say the emergence of the Islamic State, for example, and as well the growth of Al-Qaeda, despite all these operations to fight Al-Qaeda, is due because it's just the wrong approach. That's why most restraint advocates would say, bring back US troops from these irrelevant geographical areas. That's mostly the Middle East, but to a certain degree, it involves as well Europe. Regroup and recenter American strategic assets to focus on the real enemy. And that's, of course, China. And I'm sure in your colloquium here over the last days, you've talked a lot about the pivot to Asia and so forth. So what's the probability of, these folks to say NATO should be abandoned? Well, it's actually not that remote. And on purpose, I have here quotes from people who many of you, especially those who work in academia, might be quite familiar with. So these are not Trump supporters per se, but these are very renowned, famous figures in American academia. So this is John Mersheimer from the University of Chicago. This is Stephen Walt from Harvard. This is Barry Posen from MIT. This is Andrew Bacevich. And as you can see here on the slide, they all advocate a withdrawal from NATO in one form or another. So what's the probability that this restraint, which is certainly gaining steam in Washington, but not yet the predominant grand strategy, the predominant ordering principle for US foreign policy, what's the probability that it will actually take over? Well, if you believe Steve Walt, who wrote an entire book on this, it's not that likely. And why? Because of what he calls the Washington blob. So all the different institutions, think tanks, but as well international organizations, media outlets, who very much like the notion of liberal internationalism, and so will promote it for the time being and probably as well for the foreseeable future. So he would say it's a very sticky concept, it's a very sticky grand strategy, and will take a very long time for it to be replaced by another grand strategy because of these institutions. Another argument that is made that kind of favors the future of liberal internationalism is American exposure to foreign economic activity, in particular trade. As you can see here, there has been a very steady growth in American imports and exports. And so scholars would say, as long as the United States is so exposed to international trade, it needs the security umbrella to protect these American economic activities. So they believe the moment the United States withdraws from the world, or at least recenters, a lot of these economic interests will lobby for a greater exposure, for a greater presence in the world, because it gives them certainty and certain added value as well. Another reason, why folks say that liberal internationalism will stick around is the military or defense industrial complex. As you can see here, no news to most of you, the United States has a massive military budget. And of course, one of the conditions for this military budget is that it's used, and the larger the portfolio of activities, the larger the global presence of the United States, the larger the necessity to have all this money to spend. However, others would say that it's exactly this defense budget that slowly but surely makes certain voices and certain societal forces in the United States shift. Why? Because the money is missing in other areas. The United States is running very large deficits. For now, since the dollar is still the reserve currency #1 in the world, it can do it. But especially on the left spectrum of American politics, voices become louder and louder that say the United States can no longer run these massive deficits. Cuts need to be made, and these cuts need to be made in the defense field so that more money can be spent on education, on healthcare, on social welfare programs more generally, on infrastructure. And actually, during this COVID crisis, these voices have been gaining ground. And so actually somebody like Bernie Sanders, or the new super or shooting star from the Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, would classify as restraint advocates, because they're making exactly this argument, right? So like, cut those defense expenditures and spend the money on the home front in what they would call way more productive activities. So, and here, the argument that goes, as long as inequality is rising in the United States and these tensions are clearly picking up. I mean, this is what we have seen with a lot of the demonstrations earlier this year, which combined racism, but as well inequality. Slowly, these societal forces are organizing in the United States. And if their pressure is growing, the result will be that the United States focuses less on defense and more on the domestic front. And that will, by necessity, entail a retrenchment or a restraint type of grand strategy. Others would say as well that the demographic shifts in the United States speak in favor of the shift from liberal internationalism to restraint. Here, there's much greater uncertainty because we have not lived in this more diverse America. But the argument is in particular that if the percentage of the white population, diminishes, certainly the interest in Europe will diminish. Because we had for very long time periods, and certainly there's historic evidence when it comes to the First World War and the Second World War, that a lot of the European immigrants felt, of course, a much greater interest and much greater attachment to what happened on the European continent. And then, those with a Hispanic background, with an Asian background, and so forth. So they would as well point to these kind of data and say it doesn't bode well for at least the transatlantic alliance and NATO. What is clear overall is that public opinion when it comes to the role of the United States is shifting. And there are really these generational shifts. So here we have 3 different generations. We have the boomers. So these are folks who were born in the 1960s, roughly. Then Generation X, these were born in the 1970s, and then millennials, born in the 1980s, and then a little bit beyond. And as you can see here, when it comes to the role of the United States, those boomers are still very much in favor of the United States having a very active role in world affairs, and then it precipitously declines. So it's 20 percentage points lower among the millennials. Very similar story when it comes to to as well the unique character of the United States. So, American exceptionalism, which, some would argue is critical for this leadership role that is required for upholding the liberal world order. As you can see here, millennials, it's basically half-half who would say, actually, the United States is just like any other nation. And when you look at these older generations, there's a much stronger conviction that the United States is unique and exceptional. And this translates then as well in, like the idea, should the United States maintain the superior military power? Here as well, millennials are much less convinced than other generations. Okay, let's move on to Germany. So in Germany, the debate over grand strategies is, of course, quite different. Here, there are three options that are being debated. The first one is the renewal of the transatlantic relationship. The second one is what in Europe is called European strategic autonomy. And the third one is an idea which I summarize as neutrality. So let's have a little bit of a look at what this entails. So the renewal of the transatlantic relationship in its core means that there's a conviction that Germany and Europe need America, especially in light of a resurgent Russia, and that the EU cannot in the foreseeable future provide credible security for the European continent. What is new about this grand strategy, and not just a continuation of the status quo, is a realization on the part, at least of the German elite, that this posture now requires a quid pro quo. So American interest and to a certain degree the existence of NATO is no longer a given. It's no longer automatic. So that's why Germany and Europe need to meet certain conditions and demands dictated predominantly by the United States, and only in return will then the United States take care of European defense needs. So how does this then look in practice? From the German point of view, there would be somewhat of a division of labor. So Russia will be the issue that NATO is in charge via an interstate deterrence mechanism. Then there is the realization that probably the Europeans need to get involved in Asia, maybe not necessarily militarily, but probably on the economic front, meaning they need to curtail their very deep economic ties with China. And when it comes to the southern neighborhood, so Northern Africa, Africa in general, as well as the Middle East, probably the Europeans need to step up their responsibilities here. Okay, so what is European strategic autonomy? Maybe some of you following European politics have heard this term. So here, it's usually defined in the German context as operational, technological, and as well political independence from the United States. So this would entail that Europe alone is capable of territorial defense and as well power projection abroad, so the full gamut of capabilities. That would, in theory, of course, as well require a very deep defense integration, either at the EU level or among a critical number of European states, so similar to the Euro group. And, probably this would entail as well that NATO will be in one way or another weakened and maybe in the long term as well abandoned. Of course, it requires as well a massive investment in military capabilities. So how would this then look like? Well, here, Europe then has an independent choice of how to deal with Russia. That doesn't necessarily mean that Europe would engage in a similar deterrence posture. It might as well engage in some kind of great power, middle power arrangement. The same goes with the Asia Pacific. No need to follow American conditions or needs. It would be up to the Europeans to decide. And my hunch is that they would as well engage in some kind of diplomatic arrangement. There's very little appetite in Europe and, very limited threat perceptions, really, when it comes to China. And then, when it comes to the southern neighborhood, it's the same, a choice of options how Europe can engage with those security issues. Okay, let me talk about neutrality. Here, basically, it's the idea that Europe prioritizes non-military means, so what is often called civilian or soft power. to handle security challenges. That doesn't mean that there's a total abandonment of military forces, but certainly minimal military investments. And as well, the idea that Germany tries to transcend certain particular security threats by taking a neutral position. So in the European context, that's not something completely novel. This has been the position of Austria and Ireland and some Scandinavian countries during the Cold War. So, it doesn't sound very foreign to most Europeans. It just would be, of course, this posture at a much grander scale. And here, when it then comes to Russia, the Asia Pacific, or this other neighborhood, in the big picture of things, Europe would engage with these actors, with these theaters on this non-military / civilian soft power way. So for now, the position of the German government, so the Merkel government right now, is we would like to invest in this renewal of the transatlantic relationship, no doubt. But the truth is that this is not necessarily a position that is uncontested. And so who is the key contestant? But I must say this is more a contestation that is building up. It hasn't fully formed, but we clearly see the contours of what I term a German-China lobby. So as you can see here on the slide, German trade with China now supersedes German trade with the United States in overall volume. So you have a lot of German companies that make a lot of revenue in their trade with China, and they get very scared that if this renewal of the transatlantic relationship gets fully implemented, that the United States will ask Germany to curtail its economic relations with China. And they would point to what Secretary of State Pompeo did last year for the very first time, who had very harsh words and basically threatened the German government in the context of Huawei and 5G. So, basically said, if you buy this equipment, if you install this equipment in Germany, we will no longer engage in any intelligence sharing with you. And so the fear of this German-China lobby is that very soon it will not just involve 5G and Huawei, but it will be much larger. And, eventually it will even include German machinery that gets exported to China, German cars that gets exported to China, and so forth. So you clearly see here slowly building, because of course, this is at the very beginning, but you clearly see here a constituency that actually doesn't like this quid pro quo that currently, at least theoretically, is in the minds of some of those who are supportive of this renewal of the transatlantic relationship. And you see these shifts as well in the population. So here, this is, and I'm sorry that the graph is in German, but the question that was asked, which country matters most to Germany? And as you can see here, so 36% say it's China, only 37% say it's the United States, so literally a tiny difference. There might, of course, be a Trump effect here. So we need to see, what happens under Biden. But in the big picture of things, the large and very deep affection, and to a certain degree as well reliance on the United States that penetrated German society is, at least for the time being, gone. So there's another lobby, much less powerful, but it could ally with the China lobby, and that's the German-Russia lobby. So here, this is data from 2013. So the sanctions are being implemented in Germany. Don't get a wrong, idea. But it just shows that prior to the sanctions, you had as well a lot of German businesses making a lot of money with Russia. And, if they have the opportunity to get back to those levels, if there's a change in policy, why not? So you could imagine that they actually build a bloc with the China alliance and then, move away from a kind of a much more belligerent and hostile position towards China. There is, in relative terms, quite a large Russian-speaking population as well in Germany, as you can see here. So the estimate is, it's about 2.5, 3 million. But this is at the lower end of the estimate. Some would even say, it's over 3, maybe sometimes even 3.5 million when you count all the children and so forth. And interestingly, this Russian speaking population in Germany is as well more in the camp of reestablishing friendly relations with Russia, and not, continuing the hostile relations. So again, there would be just another element in this potential lobby. So those folks, the China lobby and the Russia lobby, to a certain degree, they build on still very favorable opinion among the German public in the picture of things, despite the Alliance for Germany and some right-wing parties that are questioning Europe. But in the big picture of things, this is data from 2019, the Germans still have a very favorable overall impression of the European Union. Here 74% of Germans would say in the big picture of things, EU membership is a good thing. So I would say that most of when I talk to those folks who are skeptical of this renewal of the transatlantic relationship, and when I ask them, so what's the alternative? They would say, well, we should aim for the strategic autonomy, not because they want to use the military capabilities to go against China or Russia, but it gives them, this flexibility. But of course, here the big opposition is still very large parts of German civil society. So you have still the peace movement. This is a picture from the 1980s that was born then, is still very much alive. German society in the big picture of things is still very skeptical of the use of military force. And so, the idea right now that you can massively increase defense spending and to somehow match the necessity for real European strategic autonomy at this particular moment, I think it's quite impossible, because you would encounter so much opposition from civil society and just like from large swath of German population. Okay. Let me conclude with some summarizing thoughts. So I think that liberal internationalism is losing steam in the United States. In the foreseeable future, the United States will focus on the domestic front. And I fully look at the Biden administration here. I see very strong tendencies to do exactly that. And then, of course, China, right? So the pivot to Asia is real. I don't think that Russia, while, I don't think there's any attempt of abandoning NATO under Biden, but it's not where the heart of the policy lies. It's not where the passion lies of this administration. There is a passion, or, to a certain degree, an inclination to revive American leadership and American institutions. But still, in the big picture of things, there are other priorities. And once this leadership or the reputation of the United States is to a certain degree reestablished, I think, even this interest in reestablishing international institutions, the presence of the United States in these international institutions will wane, and the real focus will be the domestic front. And as I said, China. So in Germany, my prediction is that it will try to muddle through. That's German tradition. Because of coalition governments, there is always this necessity, and now past dependence, if you want, to always somehow please everyone and try to find compromises. So it will invest some in the transatlantic relationship, but also some in European strategic autonomy, while, secretly wishing to maintain neutrality and hoping that they don't have to, think about these things at all. So my fear is that this limited German commitment, and how will Germany express this limited commitment? Well, by never fully seriously investing in defense capabilities, by never fully curtailing economic relations with China. So I think on various fronts, we will see that maybe there's a discourse, a narrative that says, sure, we are with you, we are with the transatlantic relationship, we're with the United States, or, we're trying to do the strategic autonomy thing. But I think this muddling through is likely to strengthen US voices doubting the utility of NATO. On the one hand, on the right side of the American spectrum, they will point to Germany and say, they're still having all these relations with China. How can we then trust them? And on the left side of the political spectrum in the United States, they would say, well, you know, like they're still kind of trying to free ride, because look at, you know, like their social spending and so forth, and they're still not really trying to meet our criteria when it comes to defense spending and so forth. And I think that will, you know, in the long term, maybe even the medium term, not be helpful for NATO, and it might even hollow out NATO. So what's the only way I think that this could change? So what's necessary for German attitudes to change? And that's not something that I hope for, so please don't understand me wrong here. Yeah, but I think the Achilles heel for Germany is Russia. So it is, I think, the only thing that could shift the German attitudes is if those fears are being taken more seriously, which they are only partially at this particular moment. But I think, you know, when the realization hits German elites that they cannot take on Russia on their own, that Europe is just, you know, not capable of taking on Russia, that these diplomatic and middle power / you know, great power arrangements with Russia will not be a solution, then I think, you know, there could be a rediscovery and a more broader based rediscovery of the real necessity of the transatlantic relationship. And I think this will then as well like be the only way that Germany could move on the China issue, large scale, meaning as well, you know, going all the way down to these economic interests, where they then realize, okay, we understand we need to curtail, we need to reduce our economic exposure to China so that our security on the European continent is guaranteed. Okay, I will stop here. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. And as I said before, you can ask those questions as well in French.